And thank you for coming, and we'll give a moment of silence. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Chris Nealon, and she will be moderating tonight's event.
Thanks very much, and thank you for including being on the topic of homelessness in your whole year that you've dedicated to income inequality and poverty. And we think there's so much to be had from having more people very conversant about homelessness. I know a lot of you are because I recognize you and I know the work that you've done, but we're really honored to be part of this tonight. So I'm going to do just a brief introduction into what Homeward 2020 is and what my role in that is, and then have the panel talk about the work that they have done. What we have here tonight is a panel of leaders, not just in this community, but leaders who work across the country and sharing their best practices and ideas and so forth on what's working to make homelessness very short-lived and non-recurring. So we're really honored that they have provided their time tonight for us too. So just to get started, what we firmly believe and what fits into the theme of what you have been talking about this year is that people who are experiencing homelessness, we also want them to have an opportunity to live to their fullest potential as they define it, and also to be part of and be able to participate as they see fit in the communities that they live in. And that is exactly what we're working for as we consider making homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring a moral and economic imperative. And that's the dialogue that we have been really expounding in our community, and many, many people have been working on it over the years. So a little bit of background on Homeward 2020. How many of you have heard even of Homeward 2020? Okay. Some people have. And we got started about, almost exactly 8 years ago in May. And there was a process called University Connections. Is anybody familiar with University Connections or been involved in that? So that was a collaboration between Colorado State University and the city of Fort Collins, and convened by the Community Foundation of Northern Colorado to begin to work on projects that affected the downtown area. And they were projects that were now being able to see come to fruition, like the redevelopment of Old Town and the downtown plan, kayak parks, possibly some kind of a venue for music downtown, the hotel that's going to be probably built downtown, and so forth. And Sister Mary Alice was part of University Connections, and while she was involved in University Connections and all of these ideas about how to make our community stronger and in so many ways, she began to be concerned about if all of this development happens in the downtown area, what happens to the people who are experiencing homelessness, who live down there and stay down there and get their services down there. Will they be pushed out? Will gentrification happen in a way that we've seen happen in so many kinds of communities? And so Sister Mary Alice convened a group of people to ask if we would work on it, if we would actually work on that particular issue as part of University Connections. So at that time, it was a small group. It was Gordon Thibodeau, who was the leader of, and still is, the leader of United Way, and Jim Sprout, who was the president of First Western Trust Bank, very interested in issues around homelessness, and Dave Edwards, who was a former city council member, some of you may know him, and a community volunteer and a very generous philanthropist, very interested in homelessness, and sister, and Mike Dellenbaugh, who is the owner of Dellenbaugh, very interested in homelessness, and Bill Nealon, my husband, I think most of you know him, and me. So it was a small group that got started, sister asked if we would work on the issue of what could possibly happen to the homeless if all of the things that they were talking about developed. And so that's how we got started. Soon after that, we became acquainted with the people who were working on Denver's Road Home Project, which was also an initiative to end homelessness. And they introduced us to the person who at the time was the presidential appointee to the U.S. Interagency on dealing with homelessness, and his name was Philip Mangano. So he was a Bush appointee to that organization. Philip Mangano had been involved in homelessness since he was about 25. I think he attended Boston College, got involved, worked in Boston for a long time, and then dedicated his whole life to working with issues surrounding homelessness. And by the time he got to this point of being in the Interagency Council to address homeless issues, he began an initiative called 10-year plans to end homelessness. And this was incredibly significant because it began to change the dialogue. And it changed the dialogue in this way. There were many people many organizations and communities that were offering services to homeless and necessary services and doing a very good job of that. And I think many of you know that homelessness became really a critical issue when a lot of the money to have institutions and so forth for mentally ill were shut down in the 80s, early 80s. But he began to say there are a lot of services for homeless, and that meets the immediate needs, but we really need to transform that to ending homelessness. So he became what he described, self-described as an abolitionist for homelessness. And he continues to say that he has one message, and he is very consistent about that message, and he still works on it, and he refers to himself as an abolitionist. Probably about 6 years ago, he was named as one of Time magazine's most 100 influential people in the world. So he's had a big impact in the United States, but also all over the world. So we became acquainted with that, and we thought, well, Fort Collins ought to be looking at, should we be part of the 10-year plan organizations? And at that time, there were about 120 communities that had 10-year plans to end homelessness, and we decided that that's something that we would like to promote in our community. Philip Mangano came to Fort Collins, saw that there was already a great infrastructure here for what had been already was being done in Fort Collins in terms of care housing and the Northern Colorado, or Catholic Community Services Northern, the Mission, and many, many programs that were excellent programs serving the homeless. And so we were just at the place where we said, this is probably something that we can do. And the other communities around the country that were doing this were kind of the usual suspects of progressive communities, Austin, Texas, and Seattle, and San Francisco, and Madison, Wisconsin, and so forth. So we joined with those communities to create our own 10-year plan. And Vanessa's going to talk a little bit more about what a 10-year plan is. So the vision of Homeward 2020 became that we would make homelessness in Fort Collins rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. And the reason we don't say to end homelessness is because the semantics of ending got in the way too much. So people would say, well, there's always going to be more homeless, and then you have to do something. So we just thought, we'll just call it making homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. And if you see articles in the Coloradoan, now you will see that even Sarah Jane Kyle, the person who writes most of the articles about the issue, will use that language. The city uses the language, the police department uses the language. So rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. And that's what we do. So that became our vision, and we thought, well, what would the role of Homeward 2020 be? And we decided that we had 4 roles. We were not going to be a service provider, because in the community we already had, as I said before, excellent service providers. Neighbor to Neighbor, the Murphy Center, which is really a best practice. We're one of the few communities that has that kind of a facility. We have homeless gear. We have a lot of very services. So we didn't want to be a service provider, but we did want to influence the rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. So we began to meet with and talk to the service providers and expand beyond that. One of the first things we did was a community, we worked with CU School of Public Policy to do a survey, a random survey of community members, and this was in 2008, about how did people think there was a homeless issue in Fort Collins? If they did, was it concerning? And what did they think should be done? So what we got out of that survey were three things. One, that the homeless issue was pretty hidden in 2008. And so a lot of people didn't know that there was a homeless problem here, but a lot did. The second thing was that the response was if there was, they cared a lot that there would be something done to help homeless. And the third, which was really interesting to us, was that if something should be done, they thought it was in the purview of churches and social service agencies. So some of the feedback that we were now working with Philip Magano in the 10-year plans was that if you really, really want to make homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring, it must become a political will issue, and the whole community must own making homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. And in the communities where that are really leading the way on this, that's exactly how it's been. And we've seen that evolve over time, and our panelists will talk about that. So we considered our role then to be in Homeward 2020 convener, catalyst, data driver, and advocate for issues of making homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. And the principles of the 10-year plan were it's a housing first model. So that we were going to focus on housing, and that we believed in all the support services, which we'll talk about, permanent supportive housing, but our focus was housing. If you have housing, then you can address your mental health issues. If you have housing, you can address other issues in a more viable way. And so that's what we focused on. It's a housing first model, and it's non-judgmental. So a lot of the thinking over the years has been that if people have addiction problems, that they have to be clean before they can get housing. And this is a non-judgmental, everybody deserves housing, it's a housing first model, and that's what that means. And so we had that. And then also that we were best practices driven, so we would look at research and see what happens, and data driven. We would collect to the ability that we can, and we're working on that the panel will talk about. We collect data and we say, what are the things that we know because of the data that make homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. And then we share that with other 10-year plans across the country. They share it with us, and that's how we decide which things are the things that make a difference. So that's a little bit of history. We have a board, and our board now consists of, we only wanted people on the board who were leaders of the organization that could actually take the data and make policy changes. And so that's who is on the board. We have agencies represented, Touchstone Mental Health Partners. Randy Ratliff is on the board. Karen John, who is founder of Wholeness Gear. Sister Mary Alice was, but she's an emeritus. So she's still our counselor, our muse. We have Gordon Thibodeau, the head of United Way. We have the social sustainability leader from the city of Fort Collins, the deputy city manager from the city of Fort Collins. We have, this year, we have John Hutta, who's the police chief on our board, which we're really, really happy that he decided to join the board, because I think some of you remember last summer what happened with some of the sweeps and so forth, and that's changed the conversation about that. We have community members and business leaders. The Downtown Development Authority is on the board, and so we have a broad spectrum of people who actually can take data and make the policy changes that we need and continue to spread the word. So that's a little bit about who Homeward 2020 is. And so now what I'd like to do is have the panel introduce who they are. And I'd like you to introduce yourselves by just saying who you are, what your role is, and how you got interested in working with homeless.
how I really became interested in these issues. It probably started when I was in high school and had the opportunity to go on some service trips with the youth group for the church that I grew up in. And then it was really when I went to college and grad school and was focusing on sociology that I started making the connection between what I'd seen, these individuals and these families' experiences with poverty and homelessness from these service trips that I had gone on with all these systemic level factors. It's when I first started seeing how different policies and different processes and communities can impact people on the individual level. I still had no idea that I could even work in this field though, until I moved out here to Colorado. I moved out here about 8 years ago, did a year of AmeriCorps service, and really got introduced to the nonprofit community in that way. And through that work, had my first introduction to Denver's Road Home, the idea of a 10-year plan. And when I finished up that AmeriCorps term of service, then I had the opportunity to work in the city and county of Denver, helping to better coordinate substance use services. And we worked really closely with Denver's Road Home, and so that was when I started to realize that there was just this tremendous impact that can be made on individuals' lives when you do focus at this systemic level and look at how do we really streamline resources, how do we put the right policies in place to complement the good work that's going on in all of the service providers. So it's been a bit of a journey, but I'm really excited to be here now.
Hi, my name is Ken John, and thank you for convening this conversation and inviting us to participate. I am the founder of Homeless Gear. Currently, I'm the assistant director. I also co-direct our newest program called One Village, One Family. And I am a proud board member of Homeward 2020. 7 years ago, almost to the day, I saw someone struggling down the street carrying 2 large black trash bags. And it occurred to me at that moment in time that that person had all their worldly belongings in those 2 trash bags. At the time I was a business owner, so the Reader's Digest version is I sold the company, put myself into early retirement, elected myself as president of Homeless Gear, because after all I could do that, I was the only one. And since that point in time, I've had the privilege to work with wonderful staff, thousands of community volunteers, and we now operate a continuum of care of 5 different programs, ranging from emergency services all the way up through helping folks reestablish themselves back into complete self-sufficiency. So thank you for having me.
Could you just briefly say what each of your programs are?
So the first program was distribution of necessary equipment to sustain people out in the elements. The second program that we brought into play is called Children in Need, and it specifically focuses on helping the more than 1,000 children in our community that are homeless. The third program is our outreach program, where we go out on the streets 3 nights a week and 1 day a week, providing hope, reconnecting people to all the wonderful services that we have in our community. The fourth program is Hand Up, and Hand Up is all about helping people to prepare for, search for, and secure employment. And the last, our 5th program is the One Village, One Family program, which you might hear a little bit more about as the evening progresses, but it's a volunteer mentorship program that matches 4 to 6 person volunteer teams that we call villages, and we pair them with a homeless family, and together over the course of a 6-month period, they journey together toward helping that family accomplish secure and permanent housing, as well as help work on some of the underlying causes that may have led them into homelessness.
Good evening. My name is Brian Tribby, and I became interested in homelessness in March of 2011 when I actually became homeless. I met, through a good friend of mine, the executive director of Homeward 2020 at the time, and his name was Bryce High. And for several months, Bryce was after me to join the board of directors of Homeward 2020. And I resisted for about 6 months, and he eventually wore me down. So in January of 2012, while I was homeless, I joined the board of directors of Homeward 2020. I fortunately, because I'm a veteran, I was able to secure housing in February of 2013. Since that time, I have enrolled in college. I am a student at FRCC. I'm studying paralegal studies. I plan to continue my education and get my my degree, and then go on to law school. I want to become an attorney because being homeless for 2 years, I saw how poorly the homeless and poor are treated within our legal system. You can get justice in the United States if you can afford it. And I would like to be one of those lawyers who helps people who cannot otherwise afford to have good representation. And the lady to my left is my inspiration and has kept me going through thick and thin, and I can't say enough good things about her. Sister Mary Alice.
That's quite an introduction. Thank you, Brian. This is why I do what I do, is to have people to be able to get back on their feet. I think what we don't realize is how much talent there's available in the homeless community if they just could get back on their feet. And Brian, you know, and I know that that's a long journey for some. How I got started, it's interesting, I see a lot of people in this audience that know as much as I do about the homeless. But the one who started me on the road in a way was Bruce Hall, who was instrumental in my getting hired for being the director of Catholic Charities. And at that point in time, this was 1983, the board had done some research because they had heard that the churches were having trouble keeping their food stock, and there seemed to be a concern among the board members, is this something we should be looking at? And there was a dear man on the board who taught at CSU, and his name was Forrest McCullen. And he went to talk to the chief of police at that time, and the chief of police told him, there's no poor here. And I thought, oh my, do we have a job to do? Because just the fact that the chief of police could say there's no poverty in Fort Collins, even in 1983, was totally mythical thinking. So that made me realize how important it was going to be to educate the Fort Collins community and help them to realize that we're better than this. We can find ways to help people. We can help people get back on their feet. So that's how I got started. And I'm trying to slow down, but I'm not doing a very good job of it.
So Brian, can you describe a day in the life of a homeless person? Well, how do you access the resources? How do you find a place? If you want to find a place to sleep, how do you tell what the journey could be?
I was very fortunate in the fact that when I was homeless, I had a car. Even though the car did not run and it didn't have a heater, at least it was off the ground and I had doors and I had windows. Unfortunately, for many homeless people, you have to carry your backpack, you have to carry your sleeping bag, you have to carry your pad, you have to carry your food and your water and your tarp with you all of the time. And many times what happens is you will go to, I'll use the Catholic Charities as an example. You show up at 10 o'clock at night, and if you're lucky enough to have gained a spot of one of their 22 open beds, you have to wait around for them to process these people into the actual room, which is a small room with triple bunk beds, and 22 men have to stay in that room. And by the time you get in there and you're given your pillow and your sheets and your blanket, it's about 11 o'clock at night. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, they wake you up and run you out of there. So you're on the street at 6 o'clock in the morning and there's nothing open. Now, during the wintertime, this makes it that much more fun because, generally it's 20, 30 degrees. And so you have to find a place to go until 8 o'clock when the Murphy Center opens so that you can get warm and get a cup of coffee, and you would have access to neighbor to neighbor or your counselor or to someone who could provide you with extra socks, or if you needed a coat, or the locker for homeless gear. So we do what we call the homeless shuffle. You go to the Murphy Center, you hang out, you get some coffee, you might get some a lead on a job. If you are lucky, then you will have a lead for a job. And thanks to Hands Up or Hand Up, they provide a number of people with the opportunity to at least go and put in an application for a job. They also provide at the Murphy Center clean clothes and suitable clothes so that you could go for an interview. So you go to your interview, and if you're lucky enough to have a bus pass, you get to ride the bus. A lot of times people are not lucky enough to have a bus pass because they go quite frequently. The Murphy Center is very generous in that transport provides them with a number of bus passes, but there are a lot more people visiting the Murphy Center than the center was built for. It was built to handle from 50 to 60 people a day, and they're servicing anywhere from 150 to 175 people a day. So they are basically being overrun. Now, if you got a bus ticket, you can go to your job interview. Depending on how that goes, you may or may not get the job. But then you have to go back to the Murphy Center to bring them back their clothes. By this time, it's noon, and you have to either walk or ride your bike over to Catholic Charities so that you can have your one meal a day and eat your lunch. And Catholic Charities, being very gracious, allows people to stay from 11:45 until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You can watch television there, meet some of your friends, talk, whatever. Well, at 4 o'clock, you are run out of Catholic Charities. And from 4 o'clock until 6:15, when they have the next drawing for the overflow shelter, you have to find something to do. And if it's snowing or raining or the sun is shining, it doesn't matter. Because for those 2 hours, 2.5 hours, you get to wait until they have the next drawing to see if you are going to be lucky enough to get one of the 22 beds that they have for the overflow. Many times people are turned away at 6:15, okay? So from 6:15 until dawn the next morning, you get to figure out where you're going to be. Many times people walk the streets or ride the bus, or sometimes they get to hang out at a local business who may be a little bit more gracious to the homeless. Everyday Joe's used to provide a place for homeless people to go and have a cup of coffee and stay warm. However, there were so many people showing up that they could no longer do that. So now, there are very few places in the city of Fort Collins where you can go and just hang out and stay warm. A lot of people go to the library. And, you know, I personally love the library. And I've told the people there, if you guys had food here, I would never leave. But there is also a pushback in the community from people who do not want to see the homeless there. They complain that the homeless are ugly and that they stink and that they take up room. So you have to fight that bias as well. There are a number of people within this room who are working to find and identify spaces where the homeless can go and stay warm from 4 o'clock in the afternoon till 10 o'clock at night. In other words, there are a group of people here who are trying to find a place for homeless to be, where they're not breaking the law. And you see, I haven't even brought in the fun part. The fun part is that the Fort Collins police are not very nice to homeless people. So if you gather at certain points, they will come and harass you or arrest you or see if you have a warrant out for your arrest. And this is the way many people are caught, arrested, and put in jail. One of the things that's happening in this community is that if you camp overnight, it is against the law. It is against the law to camp in the city of Fort Collins, even on private property. You must have a permit from the city of Fort Collins to allow people to sleep on your property. You are only allowed to get this permit for 7 days. After 7 days, you are no longer allowed to let people camp on your private property. If the rangers or the police department catch you sleeping, resting, or covered with a blanket, they will issue you a camping ticket. Now, the last time I heard it was $75, which to me is the height of arrogance, because if you had $75, you wouldn't be sleeping outside in the first place. But what really happens is that people get caught up and they get multiple camping tickets, which means that they are now introduced into the legal system and they have to go make court appearances. If they miss a court appearance, they get a failure to appear, which produces another warrant for their arrest. So what we're doing is criminalizing behavior for the people who are the most vulnerable in our community. think that that is absolutely absurd. It is wrong. And that's what's going on in your community. That's what's going on here in Fort Collins, ladies and gentlemen.
Matt, you can see why
The homeless call it the homeless shuffle, and why it's a moral and economic imperative to make homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. It's in a community's best interest for individuals and for the community. Vanessa, can you talk a little bit? Brian brought up what was going on with the camping issue, and it's why we mentioned before why it was so important for us to get the police chief on the board of Homeward 2020. And what John Hutto, who is our police chief, what he said when he joined the board is it's a conundrum, and Vanessa will explain a little bit about why it's a complex issue. But what he said when he joined the board was, when I said, what would you like to get out of being on the board? He said, I want to know what progressive police forces across the country who are working on the problem, what are they doing that works, that meets the needs of the community as a whole, and the issue of this rotating thing with giving tickets and not being able to pay them and then going to jail, and what that costs in many ways. For many ways that costs a lot, not just in money, and how that just creates a cycle where people can't live up to don't have the opportunity to live up to the potential they want to, and don't have the opportunity to participate in the community the way we need them as other community members, as Sister said. We're wasting talent. So, Vanessa, can you talk a little bit about that issue, what's happening, and what we're doing?
Sure, and I'll start by saying I think the city's started to realize some of these issues that were going on with ticketing, some of these low-level offenses that really primarily impact people who are experiencing homelessness. And one thing they started to do several months ago now is start what they're calling a special agency session. So this is through the municipal court. And basically people who are provided tickets for things like camping can go to a special session, the fees wiped out, the records ultimately removed from that charge is ultimately removed from their record when they complete the deferred sentence. And usually that deferred sentence is meet with the resource specialist at the Murphy Center and follow through on the recommendations. And so one of the benefits of that is hopefully for some people it reduces the burden of having to pay that ticket, go to jail, and kind of create that cyclical nature, because we know that, there have been several articles in the newspaper around just the prevalence of people experiencing homelessness in our jails, and we know that the right way to address homelessness as a community isn't through our jail system. What we're also seeing are more conversations around, well, what is the right way? And you're starting to see institutions like like law enforcement, like the jail system, like hospitals, realize that we're not necessarily addressing these problems most effectively. So if we can put the right resources into the right places, primarily housing, how do we save those costs and reinvest them in those opportunities? And so there have been some initial conversations here in Fort Collins to really say, if we can show that we're saving so many jail bed days, that we're saving so many returns to the emergency department, how do we have that conversation with the hospitals, with the jails, to say, now will you help us finance our next apartment complex where people are experiencing homelessness? Because that's really the way that we're going to make the most impact, not only really shifting the way that we address homelessness, but also hopefully for the benefit of the individual. So I think there's a lot of movement in that area. Certainly the concerns that we hear from the city around protecting the natural areas, concerns about fire and things like that are very real, but those have to be balanced with what are the unintended consequences of potentially implementing some of these policies, and how does, as Homeward 2020, how can we convene some of the conversations to really look holistically at what we're setting up in the community to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make homelessness very short-lived and non-recurring.
Thank you. So you can see what Brian's experience has been and why Housing First is so critical to everything else you do in a community, and what Brian's been able to do with what he's found with housing is become a huge advocate and a participator now fully in the solutions for the community. So he's helping the community and what he's done in his own life and what he intends to do. So that's why it's so key to have a housing first model, we believe, with all the support services, and we'll talk about that. Vanessa, you just also want to talk about who are the homeless, how do people become homeless, and just briefly talk about the episodic and the chronic.
I think people become homeless for a number of reasons, which makes the issue very complex. So, of course, in our community, we have a real shortage of affordable housing, and that's certainly a big issue for a lot of individuals and a lot of families. But then you also have, I kind of like to break it down, and you have these individual level factors, which may be, someone having a disability, which causes a barrier to accessing housing. Someone maybe is a survivor of domestic violence. Those are situations that are going on at the individual level. And then you have these community level factors, which are like our housing market and what issues that really causes. And then you can have these institutional level factors. So when we see people exiting from the military, exiting from jails, exiting from hospitals, what are we doing to really make sure that they have a stable home to go to, rather than returning to the streets? And for a lot of people, I should say that it's not necessarily one thing that really causes homelessness. You can get these snowballing effects where just circumstance after circumstance kind of build up and make it really incredibly difficult to move out of homelessness. We tend to talk about homelessness by the length of time that someone is experiencing homelessness. And so for a lot of people, nationally about 80% of homelessness is what we call transitional homelessness. So that's really homeless for a few days, a few weeks, and most people need very little support to get back off their feet, or back on their feet. And then another 10% is what we call episodic homelessness. So these are folks that may cycle in and out of homelessness, but somewhat infrequently. And then we have the remaining 10% of people that we define as being chronically homeless. And so these are people that have been on the streets usually for a year or more, or have had 4 more cycles of homelessness in 3 years, so just can't quite keep stable housing. And they also have to have some sort of disabling condition. And this is a federal definition from Housing and Urban Development, which is why it's so strict. But that disabling condition can be everything from severe mental illness, a substance use disorder, a developmental disability, traumatic brain injury, a chronic physical illness or disability. So it really covers a whole host of really behavioral and physical medical concerns that people may be facing.
Can you then talk about how the programs that Homeless Gear is involved in addresses the needs of those various populations that have become homeless for one reason or another?
So I'll expand on that a little bit. It's not just about Homeless Gear. We have 140 agencies in Fort Collins that each have something to do with providing service to the homeless. So think about that, 140 some odd agencies all working in collaboration together. Bringing it back to sort of the continuum of care that I talked about earlier. So, we address people that have become homeless, and we're interfacing with them the very first day that they are faced with that nightmare. So we're struggling at that point to simply connect them to where they're going to sleep that night, where they're going to get food, how are they going to begin their journey. So there's the emergency services side of things to really deal with people's immediate needs for survival during that 24-hour period. Then programmatically, we're starting to connect people who have completely dropped off the grid. So Brian talked about the overload at the Murphy Center. Well, after a certain point in time, many of the homeless become completely disenchanted. They become completely disconnected because this service level can't keep pace with the demand. So they drop out. Where we and many other agencies are out there trying to re-engage them back into the system. Many times it's as simple as reconnecting them with whatever is sticking them on that particular day, just getting them back into the system. And then you move beyond simply connecting people to resources to really trying to help them in a fundamental way to escape homelessness. We talked a little bit earlier about the Hand Up program. That was a program that Sister Mary Alice and many other volunteers created 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And it's all about helping people make that first giant step back into the workplace. Because certainly without a job, it's going to be extremely difficult to find housing. And so you have programs like Hand Up and many others that are really designed to help people escape homelessness. So really it's not focusing on simply the episodic homeless, which is, sort of the short term. We're also dealing with the needs of the chronically homeless that are really searching for day-to-day survival. So it's definitely a collaboration of many organizations and agencies trying to help these folks.
And can you just expand a little bit too on the face of the homeless? So even the One Village, One Family program, that many people think of homeless as the iconic face that you see, and it's really got many more faces than that. So who you serve?
Well, sure. So, we used to have an exercise where we would take groups of people and just ask them to close their eyes and to start giving us descriptors of what they saw. When I say describe the homeless that you see in your mind. And of course, we did get dirty and scruffy and beard and male and, older and, all kinds of those descriptors. And then we would tell folks, well, recognize that, up to 60% of the homeless population in Colorado are children and families. In our community, the Poudre School District starts the clock at 0 every school year, and they begin to count one at a time as they interface with homeless children. And within the last 4 or 5 years, they've not had a year that's been under 1,000 children identified over that period of time. So we also have to have programs like our Children in Need program and like our new One Village, One Family program that really wraps mentorship and advocacy programs around these families, because they've got complex issues, trying to keep jobs, trying to get jobs, trying to get kids in and out of the school district, trying to get them in and out of daycare, and all managing that while trying to get into affordable housing, which is a full-time journey in and of itself. So we've developed that program in particular to help those folks navigate the waters back to stable housing and self-sufficiency.
Can you give the example that we talked about at dinner with David and the family that you're working with right now?
Yeah, it's a great example of collaborative nature. David was talking about a wonderful program called Faith Family Hospitality, and that's in its simplest form. It's a rotation of churches that each take in a family, and they host 4 families, and they rotate from church to church on a weekly basis. And David was talking about that program, and I said, well, on May 15th, one of those 4 families will be moving into their new apartment. And they'll be moving into their new apartment because of Faith Family Hospitality having housed them for the last 9 months, because of the Fort Collins Housing Authority issuing a voucher that enabled them to supplement their income to get housing, because of a group called the Matthews House, which has a case management system in place that worked with this individual family, and because of our new One Village, One Family program that was able to help them with the deposit to overcome that giant hurdle. So there you have 4 agencies working over the course of probably more than a year to house a single family, to see that through to fruition. But that's a major accomplishment. There's 1 less homeless family with children out on the streets as of May the 15th.
Can you pass it down to Sister? Sister, can you talk about, you've been involved in the issue issue of homelessness for so many years in Fort Collins. Can you talk about the trajectory of development that you've seen in homelessness in our community?
Well, when Ken was saying that there were over 1,000 children in our Poudre School District, that they fit the McKinney definition of homeless, which isn't totally all-encompassing, but it's pretty broad. It includes foster children, things like that. Anyway, when we started working with the school district, there were 500 children. And that was about 7 years ago, I think. So that in and of itself shows that despite all the work of all the agencies that are involved, and you're getting a good picture of how many agencies are truly working together to help, still the problem is increasing. And I do hope that one day we'll be able to say that we have sufficiently been able to help as many families and people as possible, but the problem is still here. All I can say is, what if we had not had these agencies working? What if the Murphy Center hadn't opened almost on the day of the deep recession? And Brian is right, they thought they'd have perhaps, 25 people by the end of the first week, and they had 50 the first day. So the problem is really big, and that's why it's going to take all of us working together to be able to help to make this problem rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. It's going to take everybody doing something. I guess my biggest concern is when you hear all the things that are being done, and that you think, oh, it's just so overwhelming. And who am I to do anything about it? And if everybody in this room, if you're not already doing something, it's a lot of you are, because I know some of you, but those who are not doing anything at all to help with this issue, if all of us would go out with a determination to at least do one thing. And it doesn't have to be major or great or something. So the problem is still here. And we're all working hard, but we certainly need the support of the community to be able to really help this to be what it should be. This is a great community, and I think we're blessed to live in a community of people. My mantra has been, if people know there's a problem here, they'll try to help you. That's been my experience, but it takes everybody. Don't let yourself off the hook.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, of course.
I have to stand up, my back is killing me. The very last thing that I would like to say
I hope
is,
that's not your very last thing.
well, it may be for tonight, but I have a story to tell you. When I was homeless, I used to eat at Catholic Charities every day for lunch because that was the one meal that I could count on. And they had good lunches there. So one day in November, towards the end of lunch, I looked over and there was a gentleman who was sitting all by himself at a table, and he had his head down on the table, and he was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. Now, this was at the beginning of winter, and it just started getting cold. It was gray, and it had just started snowing. So I walked up to this guy, and I said, hey man, what's going on? And he didn't answer me, and I'm like, come on now, you can talk to me, I'm not going to bite you. And he said, I need a coat. I'm like, okay, no problem. Give me a couple minutes and I'll talk to somebody and I'll get you a coat. So I went to the staff person there and I said, hey, do you guys have any coats laying around? Because there's this gentleman here, he's got a t-shirt on and he needs a coat. He says, hey man, no problem. 2 minutes later, he comes back to me with a large winter coat. And so I walked up to the gentleman, and he jumped up, he grabbed me in a bear hug, tears rolling down his face, and he nearly crushed my spine. And I'm like, hey, it's just a coat. But to that man, that coat was everything. And what my point to you is, you never know what one little act of kindness can do for another human being. And if you remember nothing else tonight, I want you to remember that man and that coat. Because the most important thing that we can give to another human being is our time. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for sharing that story, Brian. And it is inspirational, and there are so many stories like that. And although it sounds complex, and it is complex because there are lots of different reasons that people become homeless and experience homeless. And there are a lot of different solutions that apply. In many ways, it's not so complex. It's how do we help keep people whole and with a sense of dignity while they're experiencing homeless? How do we apply the correct solution and work with people to identify what their solution is? We continue to say we're working with people. And then how do we understand what works? And when I said at the beginning that we're a best practices data-driven organization, that has really been adopted very well. It's being adopted more and more by more of the agencies in Fort Collins, so that all of the things, for example, that Ken talked about that Homeless Gear is doing, those are the things that are best practices, those are the things that we know continue to drive toward rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. So although it sounds like a lot, it's really becoming more and more focused in our society of how we know what works and apply the things that do work so that the solutions are the ones that drive toward our vision. So with that, I'd like Vanessa to talk a little bit. How many of you are familiar with Red Tail Ponds? Okay, so it's the new permanent supportive housing structure that's on South College, and it opened about a month ago now, pretty close to a month ago. And so in terms of the solutions, so a lot of what Ken has been talking about in Homeless Gear, the solutions that they offer, the Murphy Center, Sister Mary Alice talked about, what Brian's talked about in terms of some of those services that are filled in, that's all happened because the community, not just the service organizations and not just the churches, the community has become more involved in understanding how it's a part of all of us and that we all need to be part of the solution. So I want Vanessa to talk a little bit about permanent supportive housing, what that means and why Red Tail Ponds, and what is the next thing on the horizon for that kind of a solution.
So permanent supportive housing in general is a term that's used to describe time and limited housing coupled with supportive services. And so that can be everything from case management, mental health treatment, job and employment training, life skills, things like that. And Red Tail Ponds really started several years ago, a combination, it was kind of this just perfect merging of multiple people, multiple entities being interested in this. The Mental Health and Substance Abuse Partnership, which is a collaborative that's run out of the health district, started talking about housing needs for people with mental health and substance use disorders. Permanent supportive housing was written into the 10-year plan to make homelessness rare, short-lived, and non-recurring. So we have Homeward 2020 really pushing for this. And unfortunately, we have a housing authority that has the capability to develop housing and is really invested in this issue and invested in best practices. So all of that coming together, then Julie Bruin, the director of the Housing Authority, and her staff started looking at different permanent supportive housing models from throughout the country. And they were able to come up with a project plan and blueprint for a building that took all of the lessons learned that they had encountered through their visits and through their studies of permanent supportive housing into this amazing building. Red Tail Ponds has a total of 60 units, and 40 of those units are really designated for people who are moving out of homelessness. They've prioritized people who have referrals from Catholic Charities or from Touchstone Health Partners, but anybody could really go in and apply to be a tenant at Red Tail Ponds as long as they met the criteria. The other 20 units are designated as affordable housing, so for people from about 30% of area median income up to 50 or 60%. And the staff at Red Tail Ponds also was really they were just really diligent about trying to find people in the community who maybe had experienced homelessness in their past, had been housed for a while, but could provide some sort of peer support for people that were moving out of homelessness. So even though the building opened in March, and all of the units are claimed, they've all been leased, but they're doing a slow move-in process so that they can really help make sure that the environment is supportive, feels safe for people. They were able to partner with amazing partners, like the Marriott Hotel was undergoing this big redesign and redecorating process, and so Marriott donated furniture for most of those 40 units for people who were moving in, so they weren't just moving into a blank box, but they had a bed, they had pictures on the wall, they had a dresser, they had pots and pans and things like that that had been donated. And so when you started seeing all of these different ways that community members felt like they could contribute to make sure that people felt like they were moving home, was really incredible. Some of the things that are unique to Red Tail Ponds that stick out from other apartment complexes, they have 24/7 staff, and a lot of that's for the ability to make sure that residents feel like they have someone to contact if it's the middle of the night, that they can be supported, that if they have been dealing with maybe some unhealthy relationships on the street, you kind of have this buffer where sometimes that 24/7 staff can help protect the resident, and they can kind of be the bad guy and say, no, I'm sorry, you can't come in tonight, things like that. And those are stories that we had heard from other permanent supportive housing communities throughout the country, and they wanted to incorporate some of those practices here. Probably the most amazing story that I've heard kind of through the grapevine from the Red Tail Pond staff was a gentleman who was a veteran and moved in and opened the door to his apartment and just started crying. And he said, I really thought I was going to die on the streets. I never thought this was a possibility. So I think you see just what happens to the individual when you're able to provide that housing. And they said most people, when they move in, they don't see him for a few days because they're sleeping. As Brian was explaining, when he was talking about just the day-to-day of being homeless, it's exhausting. And so people are catching up on sleep, and then they're really providing just some amazing opportunities within that apartment with having a lot of community space. They'll be building out a commercial kitchen where they can really use it for some employment training and things like that. And so it's really an amazing building and an amazing opportunity for our community, not just at the individual level, but Catholic Charities has 18 people moving into that building, and that's 18 shelter beds that are now freed up for someone else who needs them. So it's just an incredible resource that we have available now.
And it's a great example of a best practice based on data. And so just to let you know what that's evolved from. So permanent supportive housing. So Julie Bruin, who's the head of the Housing Authority in Fort Collins, is very progressive. We're really, really fortunate to have her leadership in our community because not all housing authorities really collaborate well. And there's a lot of stories of where they don't. In Fort Collins, she's just been fabulous in terms of how she has worked, and really we need to continue to support the work that she's done. So for example, she talks about the evolution of a lot of times the idea was to, and they still do this for different kinds of housing, but so we're talking about the chronically homeless, the people who are on the street more than a year at a time over several years. And they would get a voucher, buy a house somewhere, an apartment somewhere, and give a voucher to a chronically homeless person to be in that house, and then they'd have another space somewhere else, and they would be in different parts of the community. And what the research showed was that without a community and without support services wrapped around, that people many times would not choose to stay in the housing. Their community was on there, all of their relationships were on the street. They didn't have the support that Vanessa just talked about, and so forth. So what came out of that was the whole notion of permanent supportive housing, and that's what Red Tail, it's the first building and program of its kind in Fort Collins. So it's permanent. People never have to leave. This is their place. Once they're accepted in there, this is their place. They can leave if they want to, but they don't have to. So they can count on the things that so many of us take for granted in terms of housing. And the support services there. So Touchstone Mental Health Partners has an office there. So there's always someone there. They have Job Neighbor to Neighbor has. Do they have an office there?
They have other agencies coming in.
Okay, so the agencies that are needed for the people who are living there, they will find that support right there in Red Tail Pond. So there'll be a sense of community built into the whole structure, and I encourage, when they have open houses, I encourage anyone who can to go look at that structure. They have community rooms, gathering rooms. As Vanessa said, they have a kitchen. Another thing that's really a great thing to share is the coffee shop that's at the end of the bus station, Max. They are working with the residents of Red Tail Ponds and hiring them so that they can do some job training there. And they just offered that. They came to Julie and the Housing Authority at one point and offered that. So a lot of times, and when I was talking to a person who was experiencing homelessness once, he used to be an engineer at HB, and I said, so what happened? And he told me about a mental illness that he had that was hard for him to control. But he said, you know, a lot of times I want to work and I can work, but I can't work every day. I can't go to a job. I can't be counted on to be at a job at 8 o'clock and leave at 5, but there's so many days when I can work. And that's what A Hand Up is working on, those kinds of things. So think of what difference that makes to him and to our community if those things are available. There's also going to be art programs for people who want to at Red Tail Ponds. There's someone who's starting a meditation program there for people who want to access that. So it's a very holistic wraparound. So the permanent and the supportive and the housing are all best practices. Those three things together are best practice. So that's an example. And the next one is now being planned and designed. So this is your reverse.
And where the community can come in, not just for Red Tail Ponds, but for succeeding efforts to try to get some type of housing for people who've been homeless, is that there was a lot of resistance to that going in that particular locale. And you probably read about it in the newspapers. It takes a community to be able to say, we need to give people a chance. They didn't want it in their backyard, even though there's no real whole housing right around it. It's mostly businesses, but there was still resistance, and it came as far away as Timberline. So, you know, when these things start to come up, it's important for the community to stand up. And some people did stand up and be counted and say, we need to have places like this. And it was, a lot of security was worked into it. It was not going to be a hazard in the neighborhood. In fact, if anything, it probably improved that neighborhood, because there were some of our homeless that were sleeping out in those ditches along the Max route as it was. At this time, if they had a place to go, then it could be much better regulated and they could be much safer. So the community needs, and the other great big problem I see is the lack of affordable housing in this community. It is huge. A lot of you got children who probably can't live here. And I live in a senior complex where I see people who are on fixed incomes that are being highly pressured because of the increase of housing. So that's a problem that we as a community have got to address. And while I think Red Tail Ponds is wonderful, and I know they're going to try to do something for families, which would be absolutely fantastic, somewhat on that same model, we need all kinds of housing to meet all kinds of needs. Otherwise, we're going to create a community where all the people who serve the community have to live outside, and they have to then find ways to get in, and they're on many of them minimum wages or not much better. And then the problem of them going back, it creates a double pollution problem. So we as a community have to look at what kind of a community are we creating in Fort Collins that this is what's happening. Is this good? Do we approve of it? And if we don't, do we do anything about it?
What about any comments or questions from anyone? See, will this reach Denise?
I think so. Okay, somebody over here.
Sorry. So, who have the comment or question?
Right here.
Yes, go ahead.
Is there anything we can learn from the animal shelter in terms of getting on the ballot or budget or the importance of animal shelter?
On the ballot?
Like the animal shelter did.
Yeah. So the tax initiative that we just passed in Fort Collins, that does have $4 million on it for affordable housing. So that's the first time we've ever done that in Fort Collins. And that was really driven, the city manager, when they put together that whole packet of things that was on the tax initiative, you know what I'm talking about, that we just voted on, that Darren Atterbury, who's our city manager, came to us and said, because he's been involved, he's very involved in the work that all of the agencies that you just heard about are doing, and he's very concerned about the issues of affordable housing, and so is the city council as a whole. Really, we've met with all of them. But he's the one who said, we need to put some money on this initiative for affordable housing. So that $4 million was the first we've ever passed for that. And what's going to happen now is that, as Sister just said, it's a whole continuum of looking at permanent supportive housing to affordability of working, people who are working and can't afford the prices that have gone up. And so you'll see, and if you, you know, one of the things, as Sister mentioned, you can do is just get really involved in when there are articles about affordable housing. It will be a big issue with this next council. Our new mayor is very tuned in. Wade Troxel, his dad actually started the Housing Authority in Fort Collins, so he has a real tradition of understanding housing and affordability. He's very interested. We've met with him a lot. He's very interested. Jerry Horak has some great ideas for looking at some kind of fee structure for major corporations that are coming into Fort Collins to build multifamily, you know, some of the student housing and some of the apartment complexes and so forth that he's looking at. So we have some council members right now who are very interested in the whole issue. And so continue to talk to the people who represent you on council about what they're doing. So those kinds of things.
So they also had a problem fitting in the neighborhood.
With zoning, you mean?
Animal shelter, where replacing animal shelter was an issue.
Yep. So placing also, yes, and as Sister said, that was an interesting experience. We had community meetings where several hundred people showed up, and there were a lot of people that were worried about it, but there were also a lot of people in the neighborhoods who really came out and said, we like this. And one of the other things that Homeless Gear has done so well is they've created a great database of their volunteers and so forth. And we're going to start doing that with Homeward 2020 at a point in time. And they are people who are very aware of what the homeless issues are. So the next time that there's some kind of a community plan to put a homeless permanent supportive housing or other kinds of affordable housing in the neighborhood, to rally the people who are involved and interested and know the issues. and ask them to help create those spaces in our community where we're all okay saying it's just part of who we are. So that's a big thing that can happen.
You know, can I just, this gentleman seems to be asking about an animal shelter. I don't know if you've heard that. Sir, are you asking about an animal shelter?
Can we learn something from talking to him?
That's what I thought you might be asking anyway, but,
I think he was asking for like a comparison between how the Humane Society has dealt with that issue where neighborhoods didn't want it and that, I think.
yeah.
Okay.
For Brian, I'm a veteran, and I know we have at least 5 or 6 more veterans in here, so they probably are going to be interested in, I hope they're going to be interested in my questions to you. How well were you and other homeless veterans informed about the Veterans Administration office in Larimer County, in the courthouse, plus the medical clinic that's been here for at least 15 years? That's item number 1. Number 2, how responsive were those 2 organizations to the needs of you homeless vets? And then what can the VA do to improve? I know there's been a lot of flack, and deservedly so in other parts of the country, but in your opinion, sir, in your experience, what else could the VA be doing here?
The first question. Thank you. For the first question, when I first became homeless, I had never been homeless before in my life. And so for me, it was a process of learning. Fortunately, I got hooked up with a good friend who said, okay, since you're a veteran, you should go down to 200 West Oak and go to the 5th floor and talk to the people up there. So I became aware of this, not too long after I became homeless. So that was a boom. Also, the period that I was homeless, during 2012, 2013, there were several initiatives that the federal government instituted that recognized that there were a number of homeless veterans on the street. And as of today, I think that the numbers are between 20 and 25% of the homeless are veterans. However, the VA has instituted policies and programs to get these people off the street, basically. They're identifying people and identifying if they have disabilities, what disabilities they do have, and how quickly we can get them into vet clinic. I've visited that vet clinic several times. In fact, that's where my primary care physician is at, and he is an awesome physician. So, those 2 questions were taken care of in relatively short order. The final question, I think that it is going to take time for the VA to adequately respond to all of the veterans' issues, simply because there's so many of us, first of all, and the VA is a huge bureaucracy. And so, whenever you're dealing with a bureaucracy, you have to go through, 80,000 forms in triplicate. And one thing I can say is that things are getting better. I have noticed improvement, and I have noticed that the VA is reaching out more and becoming a lot more concerned about taking care of veterans, particularly those veterans who are the most vulnerable. I have met a couple of veterans here in Fort Collins who are cancer sufferers, and I know that the VA has reached out and has done a fantastic job of trying to help these people and alleviate their suffering. I guess the bottom line is that they are becoming more and more aware of it. There are more resources available than there were 2 years ago, and that they are making an effort. Having said that, there's also a big shakeup within the VA itself. And so, you know, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's what I'm seeing right now.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, anyone else?
So I was shocked this evening to learn around the Baltimore situation, 15,000 unoccupied, relatively permanent housing units in the city of Baltimore. Obviously, we don't have that kind of issue here. Are there data as to how many relatively permanently unoccupied housing units there are in Larimer County?
I mean, I know our vacancy rate is between 1% and 2%, but for a healthy housing market, it should be around 5%, and so that's really one of the issues. So I'm not sure kind of what that breaks down to as far as numbers, but we're definitely in a crunch.
Sister, did you have a comment?
When they say 1 to 2%, that is for all housing. If you look at the number for people who need it, can't afford to pay more than $800 a month, and that sounds bad enough, it's even less. So the more people are looking for lower priced housing than can find them, and that's not reflected in that statistic.
Sister, while you have the microphone, did that answer your question?
Well, I'm not sure. Obviously, there are all of these efforts to get people into housing.
We don't have too many, to answer your question directly, we do not have very many vacant units.
Okay.
Okay?
So it sounds like it's less than 100, and therefore that's not the problem.
It's not the problem that the bigger cities like you just quoted, they have a lot of housing stock that has been vacated and perhaps not kept up. We haven't got that problem here. We tend to, as soon as there's a unit that's empty, somebody's in it. And there may be a short, or somebody's put down a deposit so that they can get in it, but we don't have very many that are idle.
Isn't it true too that sometimes, depending on the kind of how the housing is identified, that they have to meet certain qualifications? So people can...
For low-income housing, there is, you know, you have how much of the area median income a person needs to pay in order to be able to qualify for affordable housing. That does have criteria, but there's very little vacancy.
Sister, does that answer your question?
Yes.
While you have the microphone, can you talk a little bit about your Navigator program? Because I think it also, that you would be interested in that, what the program that Sisters started in terms of helping people identify.
We might even find some people who would be interested in it.
Yeah.
The Navigator program, it's very difficult if somebody is low income or they have, do not have very many educational skills, or their language is native languages other than English, to fill out the forms. And Philip McDonough, when he was here, mentioned that one of the things that some cities had started was a program that would help people get on the computer and fill out the forms. And at the time he was talking, in this community, the food stamp was 24 pages long. Well, if you have got a mental illness, or if your language is not English, or you're poorly educated, you may fill it out, but you don't know what they're driving at. And so you don't fill it out correctly, and then you get refused. So I thought to myself, well, getting some people that are computer savvy and have them help people fill out the forms would put money in their pocket and would give them a sense of self-sufficiency that I haven't had any money, now all of a sudden I can get some. So we started, Ann Wilburton is the main person who started this. I needed somebody I'm not good at filling out forms. I'd be really poor trying to help somebody. But she had been helping people with seniors with tax returns and filling out, and I thought, oh, that's just the kind of person that we need. So anyway, we started this program at the Murphy Center, and we have it all run by volunteers. It needs the two qualifications. They need to be computer savvy, and they also need not to be afraid of the homeless. And I got some people in that were good on computers, but they were afraid of being with homeless people. So you need that combination of talents. But we now have 12 women, mostly women. We have one man that just applied. We hope we can have that diversity. But it helps people, and now it's to the point that the state asked those ladies to be the trial run for the new PEAK form that's on the computers that people have to use. And if you fill that form out and you are qualified, it can help you access other services. So one of the people that we were able to help, when they walked out of the room, they get a temporary Medicaid card. Do you know what that means to somebody who's never had one? And it was a homeless man. He was in tears. He said, I never thought I'd have one of these. So that's just another program that's helping people to get back on their feet. We give them a sense that, you know, these are things they're entitled to, and they weren't getting.
And what are your results to date? How much money have you?
Over the 5 years that we've been in existence, we have helped people access $1 million. So, and it's those ladies that are doing it, not me, because I'd be one of the world's worst.
Any other questions? Comments?
How are you seeing, what's the changing face of the homeless now? I mean, when we first started the homeless shelter, we didn't have a waiting list. We have waiting lists in northern Colorado, both the shelter and Fort Collins, waiting lists to get into a shelter, let alone people getting out into affordable housing. What is the changing face of that? How are we seeing, are there different types that we saw earlier that we've been working with? We've had successes, but I think there's some different directions that we need to look at. So what are you seeing as a changing face?
So I started in this 7 or 8 years ago, which was right at the beginning of the economic downturn. And so from that point to this point, in answering your question, the face of homelessness is this group in front of me. The homeless are not what we once pictured them as. They're professionals, they're highly educated, they are men, women, and children. I guess in answering your question, they're us. They're for the razor edge that a lot of people live on that used to be just barely on this side of the equation. It didn't take much to put an entire subset of our population into homelessness that would have never, ever envisioned themselves being that way.
Are we seeing specifics? I mean, Denver is seeing some specifics with trafficking. They're also seeing some specifics that are coming from certain drug situations and that type of thing that are increasing our homeless. Are we seeing that in Fort Collins?
So there's sort of a visibility factor here. And so Chris was, telling me about, maybe mentioned the travelers. Sometimes groups come into Fort Collins and they create a great deal of exposure for themselves because they're younger, they're particularly loud, they're right in our visibility, but that's not necessarily the changing of the guard or the changing face of homelessness. Those folks just happen to be a bit more visible because they want to be more visible. So I'm not sure I'm hitting your answer, but it's certainly not. It's certainly not more folks that are addicted or folks that you would expect to be homeless. It's people that, for all the reasons that Vanessa indicated, have found themselves in this situation, and there are plenty of them on our streets.
And I would say another thing is too, and then I'd like to hear what you think because you're working in it too, but there's this feeling that if we build it, they will come. So the better services we have for homeless, that then more homeless will be attracted to our community. And it's an interesting perspective, and so we've looked into it, and we've done some best practices and some research around that. And what we see is that, for one thing, many communities actually have 10-year plans now. Does Boulder? Okay, Boulder has one, but it's not active. Denver has one. So the communities around us, Greeley and Loveland, are interested in developing theirs, and they can use ours as their template. We are working very closely with Northern Colorado. We were working with a permanent supportive housing corporation, which is a national corporation, and one of the slides they showed us in a recent meeting we had with them were all of these headlines from all these communities that said, if we build it, will they come? And it was all about providing services for homeless, and then will they come? And what we found to date is it's not accurate. That most people, there are travelers, and we're calling them travelers. It's sort of a new phenomenon. We've talked to other communities around the country about what this population is. The population that you see downtown in the summers the last couple of years that have really been high profile, and many of them may not even be homeless. They may just have be traveling during the summer. We don't know. We're trying to find out more about them at this point. But also the fact that we asked the city to look into, and because there are a lot of citizen complaints about if we build nicer facilities, people will just come here. So what we did was we asked the city to look at how many more people are we attracting to Fort Collins anyway. And as Brian and Sister and Ken and Vanessa have all said, the homeless people that we see, many people are experiencing homelessness. They read the same reports, the same newspapers. People say there's jobs in Fort Collins, there's jobs in Northern Colorado, it's a nice place to live. They also come here at the same rate that it's like Ken just said, it's all of us. We're not different from, we're just like that. And so when we do our point in time counts and we interview people who are experiencing homelessness, we say, what brought you here? Well, I read that this is a nice place to be, the weather is nice. So we're actually asking the city to track the number of increased tourists that we have here, people who come here and from the Convention and Visitors Bureau, and just people who decide to come here anyway. And we know that CSU is growing. There's been a lot of publicity about that. So I think all of those probably, would you guys agree, play into the fact of who's coming to Fort Collins, and they're just part of that.
People who come here during the summertime are basically just traveling through. They're younger folks, and they're going to Apogea, Burning Man, to the various and assorted festivals here within Colorado, and they're not really staying. They're here for a few days. A lot of them are influx of people who come in here, but when you have 800 people who are going to Apogea, then yeah, you're going to see a lot more people. Or if you have 1,000 people who are on their way to Burning Man, you're going to see a lot more of them. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be staying. And those people generally do not utilize the services of the community, because they don't go to the Murphy Center. They don't go to Catholic Charities. They don't go to the Fort Collins Rescue Mission.
Yeah, so that's really not what I'm talking about, because you're seeing the shelters are full, there's a waiting list of people to get in, they may be out on the street. You can't get into affordable housing so that, you know, Red Tail is great because it did get 18 people out of the shelter, which opens up beds. But I'm asking is not the travelers, but I'm saying the people, are you seeing different services that are needed? And how are we seeing a change in the faces of the homeless?
Ken didn't answer your question, Nancy.
Huh?
Ken didn't answer your question.
Well, I'm just saying, it's not, never mind.
No,
I just think that we're
tell us
not,
your experience. I mean, this is a lady that's been working farm labor housing in Greeley, so she's got expertise.
oh, well, we have changes all the time, you know.
But is the population as such changing?
Weld County is still a large agriculture producing county, and yet many things affect the migrants and all of that coming through. And the fact that they used to be able to stay at the shelter for a night or two before they came into our housing. There's no room in the shelters for that.
So are you saying it's increasing in number to the point that you can't handle the numbers the way you used to?
The shelter is, yes, definitely. And it's not just the shelter, but transitional housing and that type of thing. And yet, in other parts, they are seeing differences in some of the people who are coming in. And they're seeing, actually in Denver, an increase in trafficking. We usually get a delay in seeing things that are happening in Denver, coming up this way. Just like with all of our refugees, the Somalis and that, they come into Denver, and then within a year or so, they can go outside a certain area, and so they come up. That's a different culture being subjected in. These are things that change the faces of the people that we're working with. And so those are the questions I'm asking. It's not quite the same homeless population as when we started the shelters.
And I heard a policeman say the same thing for Fort Collins here, that he feels that there's more of a criminal element coming in than there was before. And I don't know if that's what you've experienced.
Well, I'm not sure whether it is a criminal element or
just a change.
Victims of criminal elements.
It's a really good point, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
And that trafficking that you flagged is something that is here in Fort Collins. We've seen it in the newspaper. I don't think we realize how that is larger than we realize, I think.
One more question?
Okay. Just one quick word to say
Yeah.
that you all ought to hear. Did you know there is a homeless place for students, married students, who have terrible marriages and much abuse? And there is operating, and it's under support by the city, an institution right here in town that two campus ministries helped start. And that was a place for these women and their children to go where they would be safe. And it's an important one, and it's almost unknown. And most people don't think there are any students that ever meet homeless. students have some lousy marriages and dangerous marriages, and they have to be taken out of that context before there is something even worse that will happen to them. And I think you ought to rejoice that at least we got that one going. And if you want a real interesting experience of how faithful the people that operate this are and how the atmosphere there is so healthy, you want to go there and visit.
What's the name of it?
I can't remember.
All that build up, man.
We'll find out. We'll find out. Is it
Crossroads, is that it?
Is it Crossroads Safe House?
Is it Crossroads?
We'll find out what that is.
It's Crossroads.
Yes, Crossroads Safe House is now. Great.
CSU has, what, over 28,000 students now. We used to live here. We moved away 2 years ago. But 32,000 now. Okay, but many universities across the United States, and that includes our service academies, West Point, Annapolis, Air Force Academy, etc., have requirements for graduation that include X number of hours of community service. So my question is, how tapped in are you to you and your various organizations to these resources?
Okay, great. Can you start?
Very. Homeless Gear has been blessed to work with many campus organizations that have come to us to support all of our programs. And not only campus organizations, but we're also finding that many of the teachers, professors, are building it into the curriculum, that the students have to provide a certain service project or a certain service number of hours, even public speaking. We've had people that have had to come in under a public speaking class to do a project and then go back and speak on it. So absolutely, we're finding many more students than we've ever had historically over the years.
Outstanding, thank you.
And we have a couple of events that Homeward 2020 coordinates throughout the year. One's a survey of everybody that we can find who's experiencing homelessness, and we use about 100 community volunteers for that, and a handful of them are usually from CSU. But we really tap into the CSU population, the student population, for Project Homeless Connect. And that's a kind of one-day, one-stop shop event in April. We just had it a few weeks ago, and the way it works is basically anybody who's homeless, near homelessness, or just in need of some resources can come to this event, and they're paired up with a volunteer that helps them navigate the event, because there's dozens and dozens and dozens of providers there, and it can be very overwhelming. So there are about 400 CSU students that volunteer for that event, and it's a great introduction to the community and to the issue of homelessness, and so it's really exciting to partner with them on that.
Outstanding, thank you.
Okay, so to wrap up for tonight, I would just like to ask the panel members to briefly just say if people who have been participating in this want to do something, what is one thing that you would recommend that somebody could do who's interested in doing something?
There's so many things. I would say when something comes up in the community, whether it's the next red-tailed Hans, a ballot initiative, a lot of times the response from the community that we hear is opposition. So if you support that particular project, show up. If you don't want to show up, write a letter, send an email, because City Council and Planning and Zoning and all of the different departments that are working on these solutions pay attention. And we need people to come out and really say, this is a good thing for our community and we're invested in it.
Engage a homeless person in a conversation. And it doesn't have to be a deep conversation. It doesn't have to be, how's the weather? Just simply engage them in a meaningful conversation with plenty of eye contact, with plenty of listening. The number one thing that our street outreach teams are actually doing when they're out on the streets is simply providing the hope that our community has not lost sight of the fact that these folks are still out there. So please engage this population in conversation.
The next time you see a homeless person, I don't want you to see a homeless person. I want you to see your brother. I want you to see your sister. I want you to see your aunt. I want you to see your uncle, your mother, your best friend, and most importantly, it could be you. Remember that.
I think one of the good experiences that are available is the point in time where people with a small amount of training go out twice a year and they interview homeless people either in the shelters or on the streets, and the contact for that would be Vanessa. But I think what's nice about that is you get to talk one-on-one with a person who's homeless, and it's in a somewhat structured manner, so some people don't know how to engage, but when you've got to take information, it's a good way to get to know somebody and to hear their stories, because after you've done that for a while, there's so many different stories that there's just no one size fits all.
Okay, and I would agree with what they've said. One homeless person said to me once, I know nobody wants to see us, so if you could just build a big concrete wall at the Murphy Center and we can just stand behind that, that's all we're asking for. And so my advice would also be, don't avert your eyes when you see them and just say, hi, isn't it a great day, or can you believe the rain, or whatever, and we are them. Have any of you had a family member that has experienced homelessness at any time? Just, if you don't mind, just, a lot of people have had that experience, and there's many people who've never expected to be homeless and experiencing that.
Can I tell a very brief story?
Yes.
You asked anybody in your family. That was me. And I know a few people here, and I hesitate to tell this, but maybe it's over now.
Do you want to tell it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think.
I was 60 years old, or 59, living here in Fort Collins in a very nice condo. I had worked most of my adult life, raised 3 children, and never in my life, never ever thought that I would be one of them. I was forced to leave my home. I was offered a job back in Southern California, where I'm originally from. I took the job, put everything I owned into a truck, drove it out there with my 2 cats, and put it in my mother's garage. She lived in a 600 square foot condominium in Los Angeles. 3 days after I started the job, it was a breast cancer foundation and a breast cancer research center near UCLA. They merged the foundation with the research center, and so anybody that was recently hired was let go. And there I was on my mother's couch with everything that I owned in the garage, 600 square feet. For the next year and a half, my home was her couch. It was my office, my home, my bedroom, everything. And I lived out of 2 boxes in a bag. One night, it was near Santa Monica, and I just needed to get out by myself for a little bit. So I went to a little coffee shop on Santa Monica Boulevard, and there was a young couple there. Well, not so young, maybe middle-aged, but they were younger than I was. And we got to talking. Intelligent, bright, engaging, fascinating. And then when I heard their story, I said, they were telling me how they got to Los Angeles, and I said, would you like to, just have coffee some night again or get together? And they said, no, we couldn't do that. They lived in a box next to the coffee shop in the alley. And the coffee shop made sure every morning that they had bagels, some coffee, and if they needed to use the restroom or anything, they could clean up in there. And I did something I never thought I would do, but I felt I had gone so far to the edge, I needed to know one more thing. And so I slept with them that night in the alley. When you said, Brian, it can be anybody, believe me, I was with two people who never would have dreamed that, she was a real estate agent, he was an engineer. It can happen without warning. And what I'm seeing here, most of us are gray hairs. We're going to see a lot of older people, seniors, in this situation. Anyway, when you said, was it somebody in your family? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this. Well, thank you everyone for your interest in this topic and for choosing homelessness as one of the topics for the year that your dialogue around poverty and economic inequality. And we really appreciate it. And thank you so much to Sister Mary Alice, to Brian Kirby, and John, and to Vanessa Finley for all they've done. And we also have David in the audience stand up David, who has done amazing work with homeless people. He's now the executive director of Homeless. Chelsea also works at Homeless Care. We have an amazing crop of young professionals in our community who have dedicated their lives to this issue. And Vanessa, David, Chelsea, Jennifer Bowman, I know some of you know Jennifer. She's the president of the Homeless Care Board. She's helping us with our HMIS system that we're trying to implement. And there's just this Michelle Christensen from the Housing Authority. We have Daniel Covey, Zach Penland. We have this great young professional group in our community that are just really doing an amazing job of making a mark in their field. And they're bright. Vanessa's finishing up her PhD now. She's working on her dissertation. It's just, we're very, very fortunate. So thank you all for spending your time here today. We really
I want to call your attention to an extra program that we're co-sponsoring, and that is Father Manager from Snowmass. He's a Trappist. He's coming to Fort Collins, and he'll be talking about Julian and Norwich, a mystic for today. I've heard him speak. You'll find him very positive, very comforting in the words of Julian and Norwich. When we started this journey a year ago, the Theologian in Residence program decided on income inequality, and we found out what a broad spectrum that was. We made a decision at that time to give a portion of our donations to the homeless program. Excuse me. And so I want to present Vanessa with this check of $1,300. And you can thank yourselves because this is part of your donations that you give every week for us. It's just overwhelming when you listen to all of our speakers this year and all of the things that they had to say about income inequality and poverty and immigration and all of the issues that we face. We cannot lose sight of those. They're extraordinarily important. And thank you for your donations and your support of the Theologian and Residence Program. I'll look forward to next year's program. Thank you very much.